Good afternoon, everybody. Just going to wait for anybody to appear. Some people are joining. Hello, welcome. Let's give people a few minutes to arrive and then I'll get started. Brilliant. Okay, I will make a start. Hello, everybody. Very nice to be able to speak to you virtually in this way, and I hope that the next half hour is in some way useful to you. I've been asked to talk about storyboarding in terms of new writing, and partially been asked to do this as I am the artistic director of Charles Court Opera, which is an associate company of the King's Head Theatre, and each year myself and my colleague David Eaton write the material for our co-production of an annual pantomime, which of course involves writing a new story. And actually with our pantomimes we don't tend to just take an existing story. We might take a small element of an existing story and then find a way to turn it on its head. So, for example, we have taken Cinderella and excuse me, and made the story specifically about Buttons and his journey and twisting the focus of the story in his direction. And we have also created some other essentially original stories around other characters. For example, our recent online panto, which was Snow White in the 7 months of lockdown, where Snow White was actually the already a resident in the dwarves' house, and that her encounter with the prince happens in a completely upside down way, which places her as a as more of the heroine than it is in the original story. And another example would be our panto western, which was entitled Billy the Kid, which took the character Billy the Kid, made him a goat, of course, and created a story around that character, which was, of course, not necessarily anything particularly connected to the historical the historical events that happened. I'm also lucky enough to be a writer for other projects, a lot of education outreach material that is designed for younger audiences, half an hour pieces, hour-long pieces of a similar nature. Again, always original stories, or sometimes taking characters from existing circumstances. And I therefore would love to just share some of my experiences of writing with you and tools that I found useful over the years, all with the caveat that I am not a trained, a qualified writer. I've not been to such school, and I'm a performer and a director by trade, who also has acquired these skills. So these are very much my own experiences, and it's all based on the experiences that I've had over the last 10 years or so, 10, 15 years or so, developing a writing style and writing skills. I'm going to just touch briefly on the process of writing the pantomimes, in that they're a collaborative process with David Eaton. And where we always start with those, and I think this is important for any writing, is we start with the storyboard, and very much looking at the characters that we might include. And often there are what we might call creative limitations within this, knowing that we will only have 4, 5, 6 actors to work with in the story. Not to say that there might not be more characters, depending on how we involve puppetry or other physical ways of representing a character that doesn't involve using an actor, or double casting, of course. And those are all considerations that we have to make, that we have to take into account. But aside from that, it's about really establishing what the story is, especially before even considering writing any songs or looking at any lyrics or any music that would be included. Although sometimes those things might completely overlap, in that we might find an idea for a musical number that we'd love to include, and we'll see whether that can fit into the story that we're making. But largely speaking, we always make sure that we have the story ready to go in its fullest sense before we start putting pen to paper at all. And that can be a long and arduous process, simply because we might get to a point in developing a story very, very near the end of that story, and then looking at the resolution of it and discovering that we can't find a satisfying solution to the story, or even one that really ties it up in a way that doesn't rely on a perhaps lazy denouement. And therefore sometimes we have had to take a deep breath and take a step back from our 2 or 3 week development of a story, and actually just put it down and start again. The thing about that, of course, is that often those elements, some elements that were included in the original story that we had concocted, might find their way back in. There might be a character that remains. There might be an aspect of the story or a theme that we might keep. But fundamentally, you have to be very objective about whether or not what you have is going to be something that an audience can care about and can stick with. And if you feel that have an inkling that you're not onto something that ties up and feels like it brings everything to a satisfactory conclusion, it probably means that there's something wrong with it somewhere in it, or that it needs to be put aside completely. An example of this would be, in fact, with our pantomime Buttons, which we had called Another Cinderella Story or Another Cinderella Pantomime, and we've revived that once and made some adjustments within it. But in the initial writing, we found ourselves in a situation where we knew where we were heading with it, but we just couldn't quite find enough of an anchor point for the antagonist. The stakes weren't very high, and it wasn't really working well. And it was there that then we managed to uncover a completely new story thread involving an antagonist, and having to introduce then a character who would be investigating a series of crimes in the village. And it completely opened up the possibility for a situation needing to be resolved that the characters could then walk into and look to achieve some goals. And it actually gave us an arch that formed it. And I think that once you can establish that, then you can make a head start. And I'm just going to talk a little bit more about what something that often we refer to, and more as a loose guide, as inevitably there are lots of things about what I'm going to talk about which can't always hold true. There's nothing too black and white about this. Inevitably, there's going to be a lot of overlap and a lot of grey areas. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the 3-act structure. It's something that has been part of writing thinking for a very long time. As far back as Aristotle, and there are some very useful guidelines when even if it's just about sketching in the bare bones of a storyboard before you even consider writing any of it down. And when we say a 3-act structure, what we're talking about is obviously Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. And that's not to say that the piece that you write, and especially if we're talking about a piece of live theatre, that's not to say that that piece of live theatre should be in 3 acts, of course. This is about plot, Act 1, plot, Act 2 and plot Act 3, and it will probably be the case that if you're including an intermission, that might come somewhere in the midst of the plot Act 2, perhaps at a point that we might call, or even at the end of plot Act 1. It just depends on where it feels like it would sit best. So in plot in Act 1 of storyboarding, that's called the setup. Act 2 is essentially the confrontation, and Act 3 the resolution. So in talking about Act 1 and the setup, that would include exposition, inciting an incident, and your first plot point 1. So obviously with exposition, we're talking about setting the scene, establishing who your protagonist is, what their life is like, what's important to them, and also really importantly, what they're missing or what doesn't feel resolved in their lives and how they might want to resolve it. There's a really obvious example of this in most things that we watch. We all can imagine watching a show or a film where a character is in the midst of life. Maybe they work, whatever it is, they're working in an office, but they find that they're dissatisfied with their life and it doesn't have any adventure. There would be a clear example of putting a protagonist in a context where they feel like they want more. Little Mermaid. No big deal. I want more. There's something that's part of the exposition and setting up here. In our pantomime King Tut, the exposition was setting up that Carter and his team were going to excavate Tut's tomb, but a personal issue that Carter had is that when he felt nervous around somebody that he found attractive, then he had trouble with flatulence, something that he wanted to try and resolve. It can be something that we take seriously or not. It's not as long as there is something that we can care about or invest in, ultimately that can lead us forward. The inciting incident would basically be the driving force that sets the protagonist's adventure in motion. It's often referred to as a call to adventure, where they are taken out of their comfort zone, and it's not always something that our characters want to engage in, or they might want to engage in it, but they're nervous to engage in it because it pulls them out of their comfort zone. And also, perhaps they feel they ought to. There's something about that, and sometimes they might just be pushed there without wanting to have been pushed there. A great example of this would be something like The Wizard of Oz, where Dorothy, the inciting incident is, of course, the tornado which lands her in Oz, which she didn't want to happen to her, but it has happened, and therefore something has now got to move things forward. Which brings us to plot point, the first plot point, which is that this is something that the protagonist now sees in their new situation they're going to have to do if they're going to move things forward at all. That can often be connected to something that an antagonist has done or said. It may be that that the protagonist has somebody entering into their life that's going to push them in a certain direction, but something that they decide to do that moves things forward at this point after that initial incident that occurred. So that leads us into Act 2, which is obviously the main bulk of the story here. This is really the adventure part, and that's separated out into a rising action, a midpoint, and the second major plot point. So the rising action is basically where characters first encounter their obstacles, their first obstacles, getting to understand their environment, what lies around them, and meeting people in that context. It's a great opportunity to introduce other characters that will help them or guide them along in their story. Think of Alice in Wonderland. Her inciting action was falling down a rabbit hole. Her decision to continue through that world was the sort of plot point that she takes on, and the rising action is her encountering all sorts of different animals and creatures along the way as she's trying to get to where she's trying to get to. And the protagonist might also be reacting to situations at this point and adapting to what's unfolding in order to find their way through to their goal. And alongside all of this, it might well be that the antagonist is being, their story is being developed, often perhaps because they're reacting to the fact that the protagonist has made a move on that chessboard, and also perhaps therefore to protect their own agenda or their own status quo. This is the antagonist, in order to protect their own goals. So let's say you have an evil villain that wants to take over the world, and it turns out that somebody is traveling to their lair to try to stop them, and so they take their own action and throw more obstacles out into the world to get in the way of the protagonist, like sending out the hounds or whatever that might be. Then coming to the midpoint in the story, okay, it's called the midpoint because it is the midpoint in the story, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it comes strictly in the middle at all, and it might well be that actually it's a point where you might bring the interval into play. It's a point where usually something goes wrong or gets in the way in a significant way, and things feel as though they might not be resolved, and in a sense it's a leveling up. So for example, in a pantomime, often this point might be that things have been progressing well in Robin Hood, but Maid Marian is kidnapped by the Sheriff of Nottingham, and therefore a decision to have a call to arms to storm his residence is put in motion, and that's a huge motivator to move forward into the second big plot point, which is when another really significant decision is made by the protagonist and perhaps with the people around him, which is to follow through on a new plan or a development in their plan that will ultimately mean that they will reach their goals. And then into Act 3, and that's separated out into 3 points again, which is the Preclimax, the climax, and the Denouement. Now, the Preclimax is something that we are all massively familiar with. It's in every film when the rain is pouring about 2/3 to 3/4 of the way through. I often like to pause a film at that point just to see actually where it comes. It's a little shamefully geeky thing that I like to do for myself, and it's often in very, very similar points. And it's usually the point where something has happened that means that the protagonist feels like it's the end of the world and there's no way that they're going to be able to resolve this, certainly not on their own. And it's often also ties into where the antagonist has exerted their now expanded strength and abilities, and it has set the protagonist back in a major way. So, for example, they've imprisoned the protagonist, or the protagonist's house has been burnt down, and they feel that they have nothing left. And it's often the point where then there's a moment of reflection. In a sense, it's the calm before the storm, where they're left to sit and ponder what they will now do, if they can do anything. In a musical, it might be a point for a reflective ballad. Often in pantomime, it's absolutely the point where somebody feels like where the villain feels like they've won, and that the protagonist feels like they don't have anywhere to go from here. But leading into the climax, after that period of recovery, the protagonist decides or finds a way to have a final face-off, if you like, with the antagonist or antagonists, or if the antagonism is actually an object or not a human entity, then that also applies. It might be that they've been spurred on into that climactic point by the fact that others that you've introduced, or other objects or situations that you've dropped into the story in a way that may or may not be significant. For example, thinking of Chekhov's gun, where it's suggested that it's very important that anything that you put into your plot has to have some kind of significance at some point, and has to actually mean something and not be dead weight. So it might be that, picking something completely at random, a pirate with his parrot who has been learning to speak but is struggling to speak and hasn't been very helpful, and that pirate is now imprisoned and feels that all hope is lost, but he finds a way of using his parrot to talk to the guard using its one useless skill of impersonation, for example, and therefore getting him to hand over a key in some trickery. You get my point. It can be something that the protagonist is offered as a sort of energizer, which then leads us into that final face-off with the antagonist, and leads us to the denouement, where if the protagonist's goals haven't been totally resolved by that climactic engagement, which might not always be the case. It might be that it's about defeating that antagonist, and overcoming that final obstacle, but it might be that there's something that's still missing for them, like they were still hoping to be crowned king, but they haven't been given that. But the only way for that opportunity to be gifted to them is by somebody else bestowing that upon them. And at that point, that person would come forth and say, because you have defeated that antagonist, you may have this reward. And it should be also just something where all loose ends are tied up really well. So whilst going through those storyboards, that storyboard that you might make, if there are things that you can't actually tie up and you have to sort of forget about, it's a potential alarm bell for a story that has some that has some flabby bits, has some parts that you don't think should be, that probably don't need to be there, or could be nicely streamlined, and a plot that feels like it is simple to engage with often is absolutely the best. And I think that we often can forget that. I certainly find that that's something that's really difficult to remember sometimes, that it doesn't have to be extremely complicated. The actual plot itself shouldn't be extremely complicated, because it is the overarching thing that ties everything together. There may be lots of things along the way that track us into some very detailed work, but at the end of the day, the plot itself should be straightforward. And actually, a great way of establishing that as fact is that if is looking at any film or any play or musical, and looking at what the actual plot is. And okay, I watched Air Force One last night, and the plot of Air Force One is extremely straightforward. President ends up on Air Force One with people that shouldn't be there, and gets into trouble, has to resolve the situation, and does. It's not. Sorry if that was a spoiler for anyone, but that's that's the key here, is making sure that it's concise, and there's nothing wrong with it being concise and really straightforward. So tying loose ends up, really, really important part of storyboarding, not because of the obvious fact that you should try to tie loose ends up, but because if you can't tie up all your loose ends, it may be worth having a little look at what you've done, and streamlining it. And of course, the other factor is creating a feeling of release and freedom. So it might be, classic example in Air Force One, the release and freedom comes from the fact that the president is finally able to throw his arms around his family, and is able to be set free from the danger and the emotional conflict that ensued from that. we see that all the time in films and shows and plays. It's absolutely a very familiar part of writing. And it should be reasonably obvious to us. I hope that gives you just a little idea of a way that if you were approaching a storyboard for the first time, it might be just a way into looking at it in much broader brushstrokes, without getting too bogged down in asking too many initial questions about character motivation. I mean, and that in itself is a separate and obviously intertwining point. That you want to make sure that your leading character also has quite a clear character arc, and that whatever happens to them does ultimately lead to some change for them in order for us to really invest in it. It's not generally considered enough for a character to be thrown into a situation which ultimately doesn't lead to any sort of personal improvement on their part, or at least an external sense of improvement on their part, like being rewarded or crowned or something along those lines, because then it makes it very difficult for us to feel like there were any real stakes. And the same applies to the antagonists. You can ask questions about what you're hoping will come of them. Will it simply be that they're defeated, killed, or sent away, banished, or is there any thought to be given to their own growth, and maybe that they actually change in some way for the better? Often in our pantomimes, for example, that would absolutely be the case, that you would consider either whether they're just defeated and sent away, or whether there's something slightly softer that can work for the audience that you're dealing with, being turned into a frog, being shrunk to miniature, or being de-villainized of those qualities and turned into a new good person, having been stripped away of all of the things that got in their way. A classic example of that in one of our pantos would be in Pinocchio, where the villain was magically stripped of his villainousness and became a good person, which in itself can be a humorous resolution and therefore still a satisfying one. Humour can be very useful when tackling some of these points, as it immediately helps us care about the circumstances. But of course, if you're not writing a comedy, then it still remains the case that it's very important to tie all of these things together and make it work as a cohesive narrative. I think that's everything that I wanted to share with you with regards to that, and we're just coming up to 1:30 quite soon. I'm jumping on in conversation with Michelle from the King's Head in half an hour's time. If anyone would like to join that and ask any questions, then I'd be very willing to answer them as best I can. And I hope you've gleaned something from this half hour. Any questions at all, very happy to answer them in due course. And actually, there are some questions just in here that I'm just going to have a quick flick through and see if there's anything I can answer. Quantity writers advisors, try to get to the end before you start writing so you know where you're going. Yes, exactly. Exactly right, Anne-Marie. And I think that, as a point I made earlier, I think that's the only thing that you can do. Without that, you should start again and really streamline what you've done. I think that's extremely important. That's very kind of you, Simon. Yes, I absolutely agree. Yes, it's very difficult to be qualified in something like this, but we can only all speak from our own experiences. But I would never profess to be in any way an expert in such matters. Anyway, thank you very much for your comments and for tuning in, and I will leave it there, and perhaps see some of you or hear from some of you in about half an hour. Thank you very much indeed. Take care. Bye for now.